A warm welcome to Energy Frontiers this week, dedicated to the highlights of global energy discourse at the 2023 Spring Meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. I am Justina Okechukwu. This show has been proudly brought to you with support from the African Energy Chamber. Let's take off with a few headlines of energy quick takes from across Africa and around the world. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries says that world oil demand will remain unchanged at 2.32 million barrels per day in the current year of 2023. In its monthly report released on Thursday, OPEC stated that oil demand in the OECD area is expected to increase by 0.1 million barrels per day, while the non-OECD countries is expected to see a 2.2 million barrels per day demand growth in 2023. In the meantime, the International Energy Agency says world oil demand will climb by 2 million barrels per day in 2023 to a record 101.9 million barrels per day, while extra cuts by OPEC Plus will push world oil supply down 400,000 barrels per day by the end of 2023. The IEA also noted that the OPEC Plus cuts may worsen the strains already seen, pushing both crude and product prices higher. The Congolese Hydrocarbons Minister Didier Budimbu has revealed that Chevron Corporation is finalizing a production sharing agreement with Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo in order to operate their shared offshore oil block. The parties have now been invited to discuss the development of the block this month in Kinshasa. The International Monetary Fund says countries at risk of declining fossil fuel outputs need to address the possibility of a structural adjustment by improving their public finances and the quality of their institutions, diversify economies, set up sovereign wealth funds, and facilitate the reallocation of production factors. That was contained in the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook report released in the week. And that was a snapshot of your energy news headlines. When we return, Africa in focus as panelists at the World Bank IMF Spring Meetings discussed the benefits that the continent can get from low carbon transitions. We'll be right back. This is Energy Frontiers. Now, Africa has the potential to harness natural resource wealth for energy access and a green transition, drive economic transformation, and generate more fiscal revenues. But how should policymakers make good on this potential and avoid the pitfalls of previous natural resource booms and bust periods? Let's listen to this distinguished panel of African policymakers as they discuss actions that governments can take to restore macroeconomic stability, promote growth, and reap higher rewards from the natural resources.
Some people would say, but you've been producing copper, cobalt, and so forth for years and years. What's the difference? I think the difference lies in two aspects. The first one is the realization that, in fact, previous policies of thinking that if you are producing primary materials, you are not helping the economy, those notions are wrong. I think for us, we've realized that if you take the example between Chile and Zambia, and I'm sure it's the same with my neighbor here, in the 1970s, we were producing more or less the same quantities of copper with Chile. Then we got to a stage where our production was going down, down, down. I think for Zambia, we got to a stage where we're only producing 1/3 of the copper we used to produce. What the Chileans do? They ramped up their own production. So they picked up the markets. What I'm trying to say here is that it is an important aspect of the economy for you to ramp up production of whatever you can manage to produce. Okay? Whether it is minerals, whether it is agriculture, We've seen other continents. We've seen Vietnam racing from behind to produce more coffee than Africa. We've seen palm oil, which used to be produced in Nigeria. The Malaysians rushing from behind to overtake us. We have to realize that these are mistakes. So if it means producing raw materials, yes, let's produce them because it adds to the economy. Now, therefore, taking into account that, we have asked ourselves the question, why is it that we've been falling behind in terms of copper production? And we've reset in terms of tax policies because we're obviously taxing way ahead of everybody else. And investors were skirting around us. The regulatory environment to make sure that licenses are being given timely. We are doing that. Ending corruption in the way in which mining licenses are given. So we are creating an environment that has all of a sudden raised interest in mining sector in Zambia.
It's important for us to understand the context. Currently, we have about 752 million people without energy at all, of which Victoria mentioned 590 million of those reside in Africa. What is also not mentioned is that 900 million people in Africa do not have access to clean cooking. This affects women and youth disproportionately. And what it means is it's actually our biggest issue when it comes to climate change, because we're chopping up our forest for something as basic as clean fuel. Apart from the issue of how many women die from these fumes that we are inhaling all the time. And that is why it is important for the role we play, especially at the United Nations, to understand that having access to energy is not a nice to have. It is essential for a dignified life. So the average African who does have access to energy barely has 404 kilowatt hours. The average American has 13,000 kilowatt hours. If you put that in context in terms of just performance and growth, you're almost 20 times at a disadvantage being a Black African. And I think it's important for us to understand those figures. So when we come to these forums and do all the great things that everybody on this panel has spoken about in their country, it is at 20 times of a disadvantage because there's nothing you can really do without sustainable energy. So one of the key things that we're doing at Sustainable Energy for All is saying that, okay, fine, everybody is talking about climate change and transition, which is really important. But what does that mean for a low carbon continent? What does it truly mean? What it means is that energy access and development of industry is at the heart of the energy transition. It can't be the other way around. And there's a cost to this. It goes beyond, I just want to provide energy to my power system. What happens to my transport sector? What happens to clean cooking? What happens to the way I build? What happens to the way youth train? We're asking countries to basically green their entire economy, but we're not giving them any more money.
I think that already we have experiences and lessons to draw on from the continent, both good and bad. We have what has worked. Botswana is a good example. And we have examples that haven't worked. And so we know what not to do. And we know what helps as well. So I think we should draw those lessons. I think what's really important this time around, as we're really trying to use mineral wealth to promote growth and development, is that we're thinking it's not just mine and send away. It's add value in country to create the jobs, to add to economic transformation, in addition to providing the revenues. So I think the first thing is to have that mindset, and the minister has spoken about that already, that as we're drawing on these minerals, so we want to do it in a way that brings some of the beneficiation into the continent and adds the value and creates jobs and transforms that way. The second is really around the regulatory environment and the policy environment. First, to bring transparency so that actors can act in an efficient and competitive way, and also to attract the private investment, both domestic and external, that is needed to harness these resources. And then second, a third, also to use regional approaches, as is being used by DRC and Zambia, because it's really important as we're adding value to think about having the value chain, developing the value chain in continent. And usually you can't do that only in one country. So you're thinking about the upstream, which is a production of inputs, whether it's a machinery for the sector, and then you're thinking about the mining itself, and then you're thinking about processing of the mineral proceeds. And all of that works better in small country, small economy context if you have a regional approach. So policies that encourage regional action, regional trade, we have the Continental Free Trade Area that should promote that. So that's also something that we have to look at. And then Minister touched also on skills, building the skills that are important and needed, not just to mine, but also to be able to do the forward linkages and the backward. Why not production of machinery? Why not producing the lithium batteries and so on? So these are a few areas that are really critical that have to be looked at to be able to draw the resources. I think a final point is managing the resource revenues in a way that it doesn't cause macro distortions and also lead to lack of competitiveness in other sectors of the economy. And that happens very easily, that we're so focused on that one particular mineral that we're not looking at how we're managing on the macro side and therefore creating problems and lack of competitiveness for other sectors. So resources or mechanisms to stabilize revenues and the use of revenues from the minerals is also going to be important.
Firstly, I think we need to capitalize on success stories, and there are some in Africa. We've talked about important challenges that mean that Africa is lagging behind when it comes to the percentage of people who have access to electricity. Some years ago, the same issue arose in the context of access to water. African countries at the time carried out extremely important reforms in the water sector, including when it came to the management of water companies that are responsible for production and distribution of water. And a lot of progress has been made in that respect. So good experiences are not necessarily outside Africa. Sometimes they exist within Africa. We should also refer to what is happening today in the digital sphere. It is true that we started quite low down, and therefore, although there has been progress, we tend to have a pessimistic view rather than an optimistic one and see the glass half full. And we don't sufficiently highlight the important progress that has been achieved in that area. And therefore, what I want to say is that through what has been done in certain sectors of Africa, in particular access to electricity with very good management, very good governance, and the possibility for African countries to also use what they have as a potential, be it in the hydro, in the wind sector, in the solar sector, and all that coupled with a trade climate that is tightened, that should, I think, allow us to foresee improvement in access to electricity so that SDG 7 can be met in Africa. So I want to see the glass half full here.
Still on the spring meetings in Washington, D.C. This time, a focus on climate finance and energy security. More on this in just a moment.
Imagine a future where tomorrow's solutions build a world of opportunities for all, and where human potential is truly realized, where every child has an equal chance in life, no matter where they were born. Imagine the potential of a continent built on low-carbon oil and natural gas and abundant renewable energy. Imagine Mozambique, Angola, Nigeria, Uganda, Senegal, Egypt, Namibia, and Algeria being let free to develop their natural resources without pressure from wealthy countries to leave it in the ground. Imagine an Africa where we cut red tape bureaucracy and provide better fiscal terms so we can compete globally for energy investments. African Energy Week is the African Energy Chamber's annual event held at the Cape Town waterfront, uniting African energy leaders, global investors, and executives from across the public and private sector for 4 days of intense dialogue on the future of the African energy industry. Showcasing the latest technologies and innovations to 5,000 plus registered delegates from over 100 countries and international professionals from across the global energy sector. Be part of the future of the energy industry and join the energy movement by becoming an official sponsor, exhibitor, delegate, or partner. African Energy Week.
The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank says that the world needs to triple investments in clean energy, but that new concerns about energy security could drive efforts to close this huge investment gap. Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation, Rania Al-Mashat, and Kampeta Sayinzoga, the CEO of Rwanda Development Bank, joined this panel discussion on clean energy finance in the geopolitical context. Take a look.
COP27 last November in Sharm el-Sheikh was under the theme of From Pledges to Implementation. We know that there have been pledges, the 100 billion that was pledged from the developed world to help emerging economies in their fight against climate action. And what was very important for us at COP27 is how can we translate these pledges into implementation, into projects, and many of the the excuses that are given is that countries are not ready with investable projects, that we need to crowd in more private sector engagement and so forth. So some of the key takeaways was that first, all hands on deck. So all stakeholders have a role to play, be it the MDBs, the development banks, the governments, and now we have also philanthropy coming in because the concessional part of finance is very, very important. The other important aspect for us was the lost and damaged trust fund that was for the first time brought to the agenda because of many of the emerging low-income countries that are affected by deforestation and so forth.
Many countries like my country, Rwanda, are actually ready. We are ready, we have an appetite for reforms to be able to tackle climate change. Rwanda was one of the first countries to embrace environmental challenges because of our topography. Way before it became sexy on the international stage, we had no choice. First, it's a question of survival. We're not a polluting country, but we are definitely one of the most affected countries by climate change. If I look at the dialogue that we've been having under the RST with the IMF, it's very clear that at the heart of our inflation problem, at the heart of our macroeconomic problem is climate change. So we were one of the first countries to have a strategy, whether it's a climate strategy, an NDC strategy at the national level, or a national electrification plan for the energy sector more specifically. I think to the point made earlier, for some countries it's a question of substitution. You substitute fossil fuel with more, I would say, more sustainable sources of energy. For many countries like mine, it's a question of access. How do you ensure that your people actually have access to energy? 10 years ago, less than 10% of Rwandans had access to electricity, as an example. Today, we're at 61. How are we going to close the gap? Will we be able to close the gap with renewable energy? In this case, the choice that my country made is off-grid energy, or will we have to resort back to the old methods, which are the methods that we all know, which are not helping the planet?
I want to give a practical example, and it also goes to my colleague from Rwanda, because the whole African continent is the least polluting, but still is asked to do the most. In lieu of the importance of mitigation for the energy security and so forth, adaptation also is extremely important for water security, which is another key aspect for countries in the continent, Egypt included. So we put together a platform, nexus of water, food, and energy, We call it Nuwafi. Nuwafi in Arabic means fulfilling pledges. And the idea here is to mobilize the financing from the MDBs, from bilaterals, have the concessional part that will drive in private investments. And let me take the energy pillar of Nuwafi. Energy pillar of Nuwafi includes decommissioning of plants which use gas for electricity. This would avail more gas to be exported to Europe. So there's a balance of payments impact, a positive windfall. At the same time, it's allowing for more renewables to be put in place. In order for us to do this, during COP and in the preparation for it, concessional finance from many of our bilaterals, including the US and Germany, and for the first time we put a debt swap for climate action in this energy pillar. So this is a very good example to show how collective action can create energy security. We are producing 10 gigawatts after decommissioning the plants that are using gas and drawing in private investors. When you ask what is more needed, we need to de-risk these investments, and this is an example where de-risking takes place. We also need more transparency, and this is happening when we have the various partners working with us on a project. And the third point is country-led. Country ownership is very, very important. Many countries have their climate strategies, NDCs, which again are linked to projects. So this excuse always of countries are not ready with implementable projects. No, we are ready now with implementable projects. We're showing that they are in line with national strategies, which also are in line with global goals. So I think what we need is to show more of these examples, show how they work and the tangible results that come out, because this opens the appetite for more participation from partners, and it also provides South-South as well as North-South learnings in this process.
So the question is, for countries that are prepared, like Egypt, like Rwanda and others that are ready, that have done all the things that it had to do to contribute to the solution, where are the concessional financing windows that allow us to do what we want to do, not what we're told to do, what we want to do at scale and speed? And that's the main reason why we're here today, because we haven't received a clear answer to that.
Let's move now from clean energy investing and explore how governments, the private sector, and other partners can build shock resilient systems that will improve people's ability to adapt and work in green jobs while mitigating climate change. Here is another panel of experts at the World Bank IMF Summit discussing on why investing in people is key to building resilience to climate change and protecting the planet.
And I think the takeaway from the conclave can be summarized in 4 points. The first one is that we need to bring back the people and human beings at the center of the climate conversation. We talk about the numbers, we talk about the temperature, we talk about how much money we need, but all of those consequences have a face. It has a human narrative. So number one, I think it was important that we sit and we share human capital stories. The second takeaway from the conclave is that it has to be evidence-based. And I think a lot of the countries shared some very good examples, and President Malpass talked to us, and we talked about the CCDRs, the country climate assessments, as being evidence-based, helping policy for all the countries that are dealing with climate. Third, the elephant in the room, financing. Who is funding the climate adaptation and mitigation? Are we funding it at scale? So the conversation about concessional funding at scale for all the countries that are dealing with climate change, which we have to say, it might not be our historical responsibility, but we have to pay for anything that is linked to climate mitigation and adaptation. And lastly, on the conclave, private sector has a key role to play. We talked about public sector, ministers were in the room, but we know that private sector has a critical role to play in the investment that is needed in renewable energy, in access to water, in education, in health. So they need to be also brought to the conversation. So that would be the 4 takeaways.
most of the real cost of climate change are going to be experienced by people who live in poor countries. I mentioned it for mortality. This is going to be exclusively in poor countries. That's number one. Number two, however, the bulk of the emissions that are causing climate change today, and I'm not talking just about historical responsibility, I'm talking about what's happening today, is due to the behavior of richer people in the world, in particular richer citizens of rich countries, although there are also some rich people in poor countries. Of course, we know that, and then we say, well, but China, India produces a lot of emission. That's true, but they export a lot of this emission in the service of producing the goods that the rich people in the world, us here, consume. So if we, in fact, there's been some work at the World Bank and other parallel work by Lucas Chancel at Sciences Po, trying to estimate for each person what their carbon footprint as a function of their place in the income distribution. Taking into account both the petrol of the car they drive, but also the emission that went to produce that car and so on. And fortunately, the results are very simple to remember, so try to keep them in mind. The 10% biggest, highest polluters contribute 50% of the world's emission. The 50% lowest polluter contribute 10% of the world emission. Africa contributes essentially nothing. If we achieve the SDG of removing extreme poverty in the world, that would increase the total amount of emissions in the world by just 2%. So in other words, there is no need to say, well, the poor countries also need to make an effort. It hardly registers. The effort, the problem is caused by people in rich countries. Now, of course, that means that people in rich countries need to work on their emission. It also means that we have a responsibility today to help poor countries adapt, cope with, which is a bit different than adapting. Coping with is your house just flooded, what do you do? It's not about adaptation, it's about social protection in the face of the new risks that are created, and of course mitigate, leapfrog the bad investment that we've done. So for that, of course, this is what, we all agree. Between us, we can repeat that to each other, but I think we need to become serious about where the money is going to come from.
Away from the spring meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions in the United States, the first ever African Critical Minerals Summit was launched in Johannesburg on Friday and hosted by South Africa's Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. The first of its kind, the event offered stakeholders the opportunity to network with relevant industry heads and discuss how critical minerals will play a key role in the world's green energy transition. And finally, in this edition of the show, the African Energy Chambers Invest in African Energies Forum holding in Paris on the 1st of June is getting closer. The roadshow aims to provide investors and companies from Europe an opportunity to connect with African executives and foster potential collaborations across both the E&P and local content sectors. Go online now and register to attend and participate at the high-profile event in France. And that's how we wrap up this week's special edition, and we thank you for watching. Remember to follow the program on the Frontier Africa Reports website, subscribe to our YouTube, and follow us across all our social media handles as indicated on the screen. It's goodbye from me, Justina Okechukwu. I'll see you soon.